Welcome to Spectrum Pulse, where we talk about movies, music, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the gothic punk band Pop 1280 and their newest album, Imps of Perversion. Now, you're all forgiven for not knowing who this band is. Hell, it wasn't that long ago when I had no idea who this group was. If you're looking for acts flying completely under the radar, Pop 1280 might just be one of the most quintessential examples. Signed to Sacred Bones, a criminally underwritten Wikipedia page, and with a reputation for abrasive, grimy, gothic noise rock, Population 1280 certainly aren't attracting the type of critical buzz that I'd normally pick up upon. The only reason I think that the AV Club bothered to review this album at all because, well, it's the beginning of August and there's barely anything else coming out until John Mayer and Chris Brown decide to simultaneously ruin this summer in one fell swoop. So why am I bothering to review Population 1280's newest album, Imps of Perversion, instead of continuing my retrospectives of other acts that already came out this year? Well, I've got two reasons. I still need a bit more time to go through Deer Hunter's discography for when I talk about Monomania, and more importantly, the fact that Pop 1280 describes itself as a cyberpunk act. Now, this immediately caught my attention because the whole cyberpunk brand used to be a lot more prevalent in the 80s and 90s, with a unique aesthetic drawn from goth, punk, and raver scenes. Heavily linked to dystopian fiction, cyberpunk tended to have underlying themes of youth fighting against corrupt institutions of the past, the balance between humanity and technology, corporate capitalism running rampant, the abuse of biotechnology, and a lot of very interesting ideas that tended to get buried beneath the bondage leather and the excuse to have fetish models pop up in B-list action movies. The sad fact that outside of some critically acclaimed anime, some solid video games, a few decent tabletop RPGs, a couple superb novels, and, well, Blade Runner, there's a whole lot of crap in the cyberpunk genre that can't even hope to be intellectually engaging or interesting besides cheap masturbatory thrills. And nowhere is this more apparent than in music. Sure, Bowie managed to make a decent pseudo-cyberpunk album in the mid-90s with Outside, and Nine Inch Nails' Year Zero did attempt a more politically charged venture into cyberpunk trends, but most music attempting to tap into cyberpunk culture failed pretty disastrously. The most egregious example of this was Billy Idol's catastrophic album Cyberpunk, which thoroughly destroyed whatever was left of his career. Having re-listened to that album recently, and believe me, it hasn't aged well in the slightest, just so you all should know, I think I've managed to pin down why it failed. It only grasped the surface gloss of what cyberpunk was, instead of digging into the meatier ideas behind it. That's why a lot of true cyberpunks of that era laughed at Billy Idol and actually considered the album something of an insult. And really, when I took a look at Pop 1280's first album, The Horror, I was actually optimistic. After all, there's plenty of untapped potential in cyberpunk, and if we're looking for a modern generation where cyberpunk might hold some relevance to youth, it's right now. Think about all the themes I mentioned before and compare them to current trends right now. Double-digit unemployment for youth, corrupt corporate overreach, disaffected youth lacking direction and seeking release however they can. These are real things for my generation going on right now. And Pop 1280 could have made a challenging and essential album to speak to these very real problems. And they didn't do that. Their 2012 album, The Horror, instead opted to imitate the cheap thrills of the cyberpunk aesthetic and blend them with lyrics cribbed from a bad nu metal songbook. I will give plenty of credit to bassist John Skulltrain and Zach Zyman's drumming for managing to build a firm foundation for the better songs on the LP, but there's very little built on top of that foundation that's worth talking about. The guitar work by Ivan Lip is biting and distorted and occasionally builds up with monstrous energy, but with a lack of a driving tune and little chord variation, I couldn't help but lose interest in the material very quickly. Chris Bugg's vocals might strive to imitate early Nick Cave from The Birthday Party, but lacking the dynamics or the air of menace, he comes across like a post-grunge singer attempting to sound dangerous or scary, neither of which I bought into. And not only was the technical songwriting rudimentary at best, the lyrics forsook the more interesting ideas in cyberpunk and instead opted for cheap, schlocky attempts at scares with little subtlety or pacing. In comparison to anything Nick Cave has done, Pop 1280 couldn't help but look out of their depth, particularly with the lifeless and flat production that did nobody any favors. But that being said, I'm willing to give Pop 1280 a second chance. Debut albums are always tough to get right. So how does their follow-up, Imps of Perversion, turn out? Well, it's not bad. It's not fantastic either, but there are several steps here taken that are in the right direction that ultimately give Imps of Perversion a passing grade. I'll admit that some of this might potentially come from lowered expectations after re-listening through The Horror, but I don't want to disparage genuine improvements that Pop 1280 made. So let's get the issues out of the way very quickly. The production is haphazard at best. On some tracks it's passable, but on others it either flattens out the sound or puts emphasis in all the wrong places. I'm still not a fan of how they bury Chris Bugg's vocals in the mix, and the overuse of vocal effects on his voice don't really help matters in the most part. And on the topic of Chris Bugg's delivery, while I will give him credit for adding a bit more energy and sleaziness into his vocals, it's still very much apparent that he is at best a low-rent Nick Cave, devoid of the hoarse rasp or melodic inflection that made Cave such an iconic and potent vocalist. In fact, outside of the vocals, I'm reminded a little bit of lead singer Marco Seresto of the alternative metal Poets of the Fall, where he chooses to drop into a harsher vocal inflection, like he did on the band's third album, Revolution Roulette. Yeah, the grime is there with Chris Bugg, but there's a distinctive lack of raw charisma that really undercuts his vocals for me. And yes, while I will say that the lyrics are marginally better, Pop 1280 are still not very good technical songwriters. It's less clumsy than the horror, but not by much. And yeah, while I think the dog motif they use is interesting, it's starting to become overused. The breaking point with me was with Nail House, a 7-minute seething monstrosity of a song that really should have been capped at the 4-minute mark. Mostly because the band runs out of interesting lyrical ideas and just opts to repeat segments over and over again. If they were trying to create their own personal version of Nick Cave's The Mercy Seat from Tender Prey, they definitely didn't succeed. That being said, the lyrics did improve here, and while the focus on cyberpunk subjects was handled a little clumsily, it at least showed up. Both Human Probe and Human Probe 2 tackled the paranoia of government and corporate overreach, and the bonus track, Machine Trauma, is a desperate shout against corporate surveillance and society's choice to ignore the abuses right under their noses. On the other hand, Coma Baby goes for shock in a cheap manner, suggesting that some guy is going to actually try to have sex with a woman in a coma, but the framing correctly paints that guy as a pervert, desperately trying to justify the fact that just because she's not moving doesn't mean she's dead and he's a necrophiliac. But the place where Pop 1280 gets the most right is Riding Shotgun, where Chris Bugg tries to hide from his crimes by saying that he wasn't the one in charge, he was just riding shotgun along. This is the song that gets closest to the Nick Cave-esque darkness, and it gets there not through describing what he does, but by leaving Bugg's stoned, hollow delivery to speak for it, and letting us use our imagination. And thus, in our minds, we create the far more horrifying vision. That's how proper horror works, and they actually do manage to get it right here. But I want to really focus on what Pop 1280 does improve in a big way. Their instrumentation. On the best tracks of the album, the foundation of Skulltrain's bass and Zyman's drumming is used to ground the atmosphere, the bass alternating between sounding hollow and murky to imposing and threatening. The introduction of more electronic elements and keyboards are handled much more deftly on this album, as subtle touches to enhance that cyberpunk element, which letting the guitar produce a churning background that roils and crashes when it's finally brought to the front of the mix. The choice to allow more organic guitar work is definitely a good step in my view, because it allows real melodies to surface throughout the noise, which they often didn't do on the previous album. Now, all of these elements were present on the previous album, except the organic guitar, obviously. What is improved here is the interplay between Skulltrain and Ivan Lip, which leads to well-executed changes in tempo and energy, which add a fair amount of brooding flavor to the album, not to mention some real personality. This is best shown on the downbeat Riding Shotgun, as Ivan Lip's guitar develops a country-esque twang and lets Skulltrain's bass thrum in the background. Not so much interplay, but perfect balance. To summarize things, if Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds are the archdevils in charge of the Courts of Darkness, Population 1280 are the cackling imps on the edges of the court, grimy and wretched. The album is punishingly bleak, and while it still isn't quite scary or all that imposing, it does occasionally manage to be unsettling. There are still some issues that need to be addressed. Chris Bugg's voice still doesn't have a lot of melodic range, the songs could easily be shorter and achieve better results, the technical songwriting could definitely be improved, and the lack of more focused cyberpunk material continues to disappoint me. But this is a step in the right direction, and I found myself surprised how much I ended up enjoying Imps of Perversion in the end. So if you're a fan of dark gothic punk or noise rock, you could definitely do worse. So thanks for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I've got more videos on the way. See you next time.